La 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 la. La 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 la. And that was Matthew West. You're listening to 100.1 Remnant Radio, the radio station of your life. So good to be with you all this morning. Well, I'm excited. Over this next hour, I will be playing an interview I recently did with Darrell Bock, who is a prolific and seasoned New Testament scholar. This is a man that writes commentaries and books upon books over what the New Testament and even the Old Testament, really all of the Bible, has to say about who Jesus is, the historical context. So he's deep in the biblical world and time period. And yet recently, just this year, he came out with a book called Cultural Intelligence, Living for God in a Diverse and Pluralistic World. And that's really something I've been trying to encourage the listeners of the show to think about. One is, if we're transformed by the gospel message, then how does that shape our lives? How do we go out and live in a world that has very different views on a number of issues than we do? And two, I'm just encouraging people to be aware of solid Christian literature, of important ideas that are coming out this year that are new and that are worth knowing about, because I truly believe we're shaped by our ideas, and we are shaped by how we think about certain issues. It really influences a lot of behavior. So I encourage you to check out this conversation, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with you right now. By how we think about certain issues, it really influences a lot of behavior. So I encourage you to check out this conversation, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with you right now. Darrell Bock, I greatly appreciate you doing this interview.
Glad to be with you. It's always good to connect to people who are in Southern California.
Of course. And so you recently wrote this work, Cultural Intelligence, Living for God in a Diverse, Pluralistic World. It just came out 10 days ago, and I wanted to give you a chance to introduce yourself a bit. I'm familiar with your work as a New Testament scholar, writing long commentaries on the book of Luke and Acts, but I was not aware of your work in cultural engagement. And you are at Dallas Theological Seminary as the executive director of cultural engagement. So would you share a little bit about that position?
Yeah, I've been doing this for about a decade now at the Hendricks Center. It's a Center for Christian Leadership. And we were originally focused on the character of the leader and the nature of leadership. And then it became clear to us that only by understanding the context, only when a leader understands the context in which they function, can they really effectively lead. And so I've been actually working in this space really for several decades, originally doing stuff related to historical Jesus and engagement in the public square. Then it expanded. I did a book called Breaking the Da Vinci Code, which went right into this space. Then I've done a book more recently, How Would Jesus Vote? That was before the last election. And then now this Cultural Intelligence book, which is a biblical theology of cultural engagement.
Right. So you've been writing in this space for some time, and really, as a historian and New Testament scholar, you need to understand the first century culture. But then it's another set of skills to speak into our current culture. And that's something not many New Testament scholars do.
That's correct. And then the other thing that, of course, has happened is there's been a huge cultural shift in my lifetime in terms of our own internal culture here in the United States, in which the Judeo-Christian values were kind of undergirding the culture and were a part of the culture. I call it a Judeo-Christian net that surrounded the culture that caught people whether they went to church or not. That is no longer the case. That shift, along with several others, all in our lifetime, the explosion of communication, the movement of people, I say the world's both simultaneously bigger and smaller simultaneously. There are more of us, but we're more tightly connected in communication. And so all those changes have brought a much more diverse, pluralistic world and set of worldviews. And then culture, I tell people culture is like a misnomer because we think about it as singular. It's actually cultures. It's a collection of subcultures that are like plate tectonics, I talk about plate tectonics. I know I'm speaking in California, people understand what that is because they live with plate tectonics. They rub against each other, and eventually the pressure builds up, and boom, you get disruption. I'll say it that way. And so learning how to live in the midst of these diverse cultures that bang into each other is part of what has become the challenge of modern life.
That's right. And I know Christians feel that tension when we look at texts that encourage us to love our neighbors and love those people that are in the world, but to not love the worldly system itself and the worldly ideology itself. We want to see ourselves as citizens of the kingdom of heaven, and yet we have to live in a way that makes the city that we live in now better.
That's right. So you've got the passage in Jeremiah, which of course is the example of the Israelites being taken to Babylon. I like to remind people Babylon wasn't exactly the most Christian culture in the world. It was, it was kind of the example of a pagan culture. And yet the Old Testament Jeremiah says to the Israelites who are going there, serve the city, and so the emphasis is on the way in which you contribute to the well-being of the people around you, even when the people around you are very different than yourself.
That's right. So one term that I often hear is cultural warfare, right? And that could be one way of seeing the model of Christians engaging with culture is we've got to go in and spread the truth about our view of sexuality and the truth about our view of abortion and maybe all kinds of distinctive Christian positions on social issues. And it sounds very combative. What do you make of that model?
Well, actually, the first chapter of Cultural Intelligence deals with this directly, because I go directly to Ephesians 6, which is the battle text of the New Testament. And the point that I like to make from Ephesians 6:12 is what it doesn't say, as well as what it does say. It says our battle is not, that's emphatic, against blood and flesh, is actually the way the Greek reads. It's not against people. People are not the enemy. They're actually the goal, if you think about the Great Commission. So, but we are struggling against the powers and the principalities and the cosmocrats of this world, which is spiritual forces. I tell people, if you think a bureaucrat's bad, meet a cosmocrat. And so, when you're engaging, you need to realize this is a spiritual battle. And then when you look at the armor, so what protects us? Well, what protects us is the nature of our lived out faith. So it's righteousness, it's peace shot with the gospel, it's the truth, it's prayer, it's the Holy Spirit, it's the Word of God. And when we maintain our faith integrity faithfully by the way that we live, that's the defense. It's not in political ideologies, it's not in the circumstances that are around us, it's not in a form of nationalism, it's in our commitment to our own faith and the reflection of our own citizenship as citizens of heaven. That's where the battle is fought. That's where the battle is won. And we fight not to gain ground, but to maintain the ground that God has given us, so that we invite people into sacred space. That's what the gospel does. And so a lot of the language we have about kingdom expansion, all that kind of stuff, isn't actually very biblical. The world is going to be with us till Jesus comes back and fixes it. In the meantime, we're supposed to be faithful in how we live out the way God has called us to live as a distinct people in the midst of that world, which means we're going to be filled with difficult conversations.
Well, and then there's the other side of those that maybe instead of wanting to go out and fight culture wars would be tempted towards a disengagement and an isolation. Let's get in my holy huddle.
Actually, you're right. There are three bad approaches. One is the combative approach that makes people the enemy. The other is the withdrawal approach, which says, oh, well, I don't need to do anything. And the third is what I call the assimilating approach, which means there's no distinctions between the way a believer looks and an unbeliever looks. So those are three ways how not to do it. So how do you do it? You live faithfully before God. You're very concerned about the quality and character of your own community and the quality and character of your own life. And you want those to be in congruence. The place where people should really be able to see the activity of God is in the communities that the people of God form. We don't pay enough attention to that. We spend so much time talking about how the world's living that we actually don't pay enough attention about how our own communities are functioning. So that's another dimension of the equation as well. And then when you engage in a way to invite people hopefully into an alternative space and a way of life that is distinctive from what's going on around them, and yet at the same time is inviting.
And that's a tension you get to pretty early in the book. We have to have that balance between the invitation and the challenge of the gospel.
That's right. And you never leave that. So you've got to know how to be able to stand up for your convictions, how to have what a lot of people call convicted civility, a conviction, but doing it civilly that communicates respect. A lot of passages talk about respect as you communicate with the outsider, meekness as you communicate with the outsider, gentleness as you communicate with the outsider. Let your speech always be gracious. I like to remind people that always is a very technical term. It means all the time. And so, so I don't get to switch. I don't get to switch that off. And so the way we engage is as important as what we are engaging with. The church has often been so committed to the truth that it hasn't given much thought to the tone with which it communicates. Both are very, very important.
Right alongside that, though, is you also bring out another sense in which who we're speaking with influences how we engage them. And there's a difference between Paul's method in Romans 1 and Acts 17. So
That's
would you
right.
speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, and we were talking earlier about how the world has changed and how you need to study the first century. The beauty of studying the first century is that the church did very well when it had no social or political power, which means the church can function in that environment, which means there's nothing to fear about the changes going on around us. Okay, we've been there and done that. Okay, I like to tease people. In fact, I have one message that's called Back to the Future. That if you look at the first century, you're going back to the future and how we need to think about engagement. So in Romans 1, Paul is very clear about the nature of the culture. In fact, you read Romans 1 and you think, Paul must have been watching the 10 o'clock news. There's nothing that he describes there that we don't recognize. It's there, and he's very direct. And he says the culture, frankly, is a mess. In fact, it's summarized in a very technical theological term that I'm sure all your people will appreciate. It's the term yuck. Okay. Okay. I tease our systematic theologians. We need a course in yuckology. Yuck. Okay.
That's a Greek term. Yep.
That's a Greek term. Yeah. It's a universal term. And so, he's very direct. He also is very clear about something that we miss, because normally people go to that passage today to talk about the example of sexuality that's in the middle of the passage that shows how far down we have come. At least that's the way you hear the argument. But actually that passage goes on and it gives a list of vices. And then at the very end of the list of vices, it says, and the problem is that people not only do these things, plural, okay, but encourage people that do them, also plural. And so I like to tell my students, grammar does matter sometimes. We're not talking about one thing in this passage. We're talking about this list. And in fact, when I was teaching this passage once, someone who worked with high schoolers came up to me afterwards and said, when I teach this passage, I haven't put the initials by the thing that catches them out. Which I thought, that's a nice move, because that text is setting up Romans 3. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We're all in the same boat without God. We all have problems that separate us from God. Sin is a separator that separates us from God. Christians just have the benefit of applied forgiveness to that sin, which we're trying to encourage people to avail themselves of, because that allows God to do a work from within us that we desperately need, because without it, we can't live in a way that's honoring to Him. And then Acts 17, he talks to that culture. And that passage begins by noting Paul went around and looked at the idols, and he was provoked by what he saw. So we know his blood pressure changed when he saw the idols. We know he's in the same state of mind as when he was writing Romans 1, when he was writing about idols. Okay? And yet the first thing he says to them is, I see that you're very religious. And I'm a child of the 60s, of the 1960s. So when I read that passage, I go, Paul, what were you smoking? I mean, when you said this, how could you possibly call a group of idolaters religious? And here's what he's doing. What he's doing is he says, I see you're interested in spiritual things and engaged with spiritual things. Let's talk about that. And so it's a way in. And it's a way in that is respectful on the one hand, But then he moves right into the challenge in his speech. He's not backing off. He's challenging. You think God can be contained in a building? You think you can make images of God? And what he does is he starts with where they are coming from and gives them questions to give them pause. Greg Kunkel is, I'm sure, a name you know, says it's putting a rock in their shoe. You know, when you get a rock in your shoe, it's irritating. You know, and you keep walking, and you shake your foot, and you try and get it out. Finally, you have to give up. You have to pull the shoe off, get the rock out of your shoe, then you can walk on. A rock in the shoe is putting something in the person's thought process that will give them pause. Okay, it will make them think about and consider what the gospel is all about. That's what you're trying to do when you engage.
Yeah. And again, that was Darrell Bock. You're listening to 100.1 Remnant Radio. I was speaking with this New Testament scholar, Darrell Bock, over the importance of being culturally aware of the ideology, of the views that other people have. As Christians, we need to not be disengaged from the world and strictly in our recluse closet, but we need to be actively engaged in the philosophies and ideologies and the different viewpoints other people are coming from, so that when we share the gospel and evangelize, we can speak into what they believe. And he was appealing to Acts 17 there, which is an excellent example from Paul. Knowing the different philosophers and the men of Athens, he appealed to their own view when he says that he sees to the unknown God. They have this statue and they worship him, but they don't know who he is. And he recognizes that they know that the divine is in whom we live and move and have our being, as it says in Acts 17:28. But they don't recognize that that's actually the true God, that they have that ingrained, written on their hearts. And so he appeals to that as he makes that transition, that bridge to sharing the gospel message with them and sharing about the work that God has done throughout history. So again, I encourage you to think about how you can be learning about the different philosophies, viewpoints that other people may be coming from in a respectful, loving, charitable, but accurate way, so that you can speak into their life. That's what we're called to do as Christians. Be ready to give a reason for the hope that is within us, as it says in 1 Peter 3:15. Well, I encourage you to keep listening. We're going to be back with more from Darrell Bock. And you're listening to 100.1 Remnant Radio, the radio station of your life. This is Matthew West. The song is Do Something. I love this one. Check it out.
I woke up this morning, saw a world full of trouble now. I thought, how do we ever get so far